Hey guys, welcome to today's Daily Fantasy Cafe GPP Chin Music podcast. Justin's not here today, so I'll be filling in for him doing this solo. We're going to walk through basically all the GPP plays at every position for Friday's MLB slate. Let's start out with some pitchers. Obviously, your top option today, as he is basically every time he pitches at this point in the season, is Chris Sale. The guy's been absolutely on fire for the last 6 or 7 starts here. We've seen him put up 5 straight double-digit strikeout games. He's pitching deep into games. Only went 6 2/3 the last time out, but had gone 7+ in the 4 or 5 starts before that. He's looked really impressive. His slider's back to the really dominant form it was last season. He struggled a little bit early in the year, but at this point, I mean, there's really no questions about what he is, and that's the best pitcher on the slate today. He's facing a Texas team that has been better over the last month or so than they have been early in the season, but still not a team I'm really scared of, especially against lefties. Their WOBA against lefties is right around the league average, just a little bit below it. Sale's a pretty massive and the biggest favorite on the slate at -172 right now. Only a 7 over-under in this game. He's $1,100, $11.9 on DraftKings, a little bit cheaper than that on FanDuel, where he's sitting at a flat 11,000. So he's going to be my cash game play tonight, most likely. I like him at GPPs, but as we've seen over the past 3 or 4 starts here, he's massively owned in GPPs. And if you can pitch someone else and he ends up with, say, like the 31 DraftKings points he had last time out, you can make some pretty interesting GPP swerves against him. However, if he puts up a game like the 2 or 3 before that where he's putting up 40+, almost 45 fantasy points, racking up the win and big double-digit strikeout totals, it's going to be really hard to win a GPP without him. So he makes GPPs really tough on the slates that he's pitching. My second favorite option is actually a much cheaper guy. He's a little bit pricier on DraftKings. Lance McCullers is $8,000 on DraftKings, only $6,700 on FanDuel. And I think he makes a great GPP play away from Chris Sale on FanDuel, maybe with him on DraftKings, but that starts to get a little bit pricey with McCullers being priced up there. But he's at Seattle, which is a great pitcher's park. A -132 favorite right now against a Seattle team that just really hasn't been hitting all that well. Most of their guys have been struggling. Obviously, they have some bats that scare you from time to time, like Nelson Cruz, but their offense just really hasn't been that good. He'll be facing Elias today, which isn't a matchup that I'm really too worried about. McCullers only had 4 strikeouts in the last game, but he had been striking out a ton of batters, 18 over the 2 games before that. I don't think he's as good as he was in those 2 games, but he's also a little bit better than he was the last time out. So I think he has some nice strikeout upside here. The low run total, another 7, matches up with what Chris Sale has in Texas. So he's going to be my first swerve away from Chris Sale if I'm going that direction. Obviously, having those 2 guys in cash games is great on DraftKings, but they're going to be pretty heavy owned, so it's tough to play that duo in GPPs. One of the guys I really like in GPPs today is Carlos Carrasco for Cleveland against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay isn't hitting anyone right now. He's a -155 favorite, so he's a solid play for the win here. 8,800 is a decent price, one that's high enough that it'll keep, I think, the masses away from drafting him too much, which makes him a better GPP play than the first 2 guys we talked about here. Another guy that is in a really similar situation to that is Jacob deGrom is 10-7 on DraftKings, a little bit cheaper on FanDuel, but not very much. I mean, we're talking about 10-8 there, even though it's a 1-pitcher site. Probably not a price a lot of people are really going to want to pay, but he is a pretty nice option here today, as he's a -135 favorite facing an Atlanta team that doesn't put a ton of runs on the board, but they've also been not striking out very much, which makes it really tough to play him in GPPs. So I think his ownership will be pretty low. If he can rack up some strikeouts here, despite the fact that Atlanta doesn't strike out much, he could be a really strong GPP option at what I expect to be a really low ownership percentage. I think we'll probably see more Sonny Gray in GPP lineups because he's a little bit cheaper on both sites. He's 10-1 on FanDuel and on DraftKings. And he's a bigger favorite than DeGrom at -160. The Angels' offense has struck out a little bit more, and they're right around the same as Atlanta. So I think he's going to be the play that most people will gravitate towards, which is going to make DeGrom a really low-owned option today. As far as other pitchers, A.J. Burnett faces off against Washington, a small favorite there at -118. Washington hasn't been fantastic, but you always have to worry about Bryce Harper there. He's questionable today, though, so if he's out of the lineup, I think A.J. Burnett makes a pretty interesting play at 8,700 on DraftKings. He's a little bit pricier on FanDuel at 9,200, probably only an option if Bryce Harper's out of the lineup. Most of the rest of these guys today are small favorites. Phil Hughes is a small favorite against the Cubs, who we know strike out a ton. The Cubs' offense is pretty good, though, especially against righties. I don't love playing him. 7,200 can make him potentially a price play in GPPs on DraftKings. 73 on FanDuel is probably going to keep me away from him there. Another guy in a similar situation is Justin Verlander against the Yankees team that strikes out a decent amount too. Verlander's looked okay so far since returning from the injury that kept him out at the beginning part of the season here. But one of the things that you have to consider with Verlander is he's only made one start so far, and he's only gone 5 innings in that start. So you're not looking at the Verlander of old that you could count on to go 7-8 innings most of the time. Maybe he gets there today, maybe he doesn't. It might take a couple more starts before he can work his way up to 100, 110 pitches like we really need from a pitcher at his price range to be viable, really. So he's going to stay away definitely from cash games for me, probably for GPPs also. 8,200 on DraftKings is just way too expensive for me to pay that. 7,700 on FanDuel is a little bit better, but still not a guy that I'm going to be targeting a lot. As usual, the guy pitching for the Dodgers, Michael Bolsinger, is a strong -140 favorite against San Francisco. Basically, the Dodgers pitchers have been like this every day because the Dodgers have been such a good team this season. He's facing off against Chris Heston, who we know has some upside. I actually prefer Heston in this matchup, I think, although I'm not particularly excited about throwing him. We saw him respond after that 11 strikeout no-hitter against the Mets with a not-so-good game against Arizona, where he only went 5 innings, had 6 strikeouts, only gave up 2 runs, but just wasn't dominant like we saw a couple times this season where he's thrown complete games. He's definitely a GPP play. I like him more than Bolsinger as a GPP play. Bolsinger feels like a borderline cash game play at best, where Heston has some nice upside if he can keep the ball on the ground, rack up some strikeouts. Both these guys are around the same price on both sites in the mid-7s. So that's where I'm going to be looking for some, I guess, salary relief in GPPs, I guess. I just don't love Bolsinger's upside. He's not a big strikeout guy. He hasn't been pitching deep into games. There's just not a lot to like there. A couple other options. There's plenty of other pitchers on the slate. We know it's a full slate, like almost all Fridays are with 15 games, but there's a lot of pick'em games here. Not a lot of guys that are big favorites. Not a lot of big strikeout guys towards the bottom. Heston is probably my favorite cheap option. You can look at some of these other guys a little bit. Like if you want to look at Eduardo Rodriguez for Boston, maybe. He's facing Kansas City, though, who's been really strong all season offensively. Not a guy that I love particularly. The other problem is there's no one that's really, really cheap today and viable. I mean, the only guy that I would even consider looking at below that really is Rodriguez, and he's just not a guy I want to target against Kansas City. You could look at Michael Weisler, I guess, for Atlanta against the Mets because their offense has been struggling so much, but he's not a favorite. He's 6,100, not really cheap enough for me to go after him. I'm probably going to be paying up at pitcher for the most part today. There's so many good options at the top, especially GPPs. And with a full slate of games, you'll be able to find enough cheap options hitter-wise that you don't really have to worry about saving money at pitcher, especially on FanDuel where you only need to select one. Just pay for a pitcher you really like today and don't Don't do anything crazy. I think the obvious cheap option at FanDuel is going to be McCullers, and he's going to be really heavily owned. So if you're looking to get some diversity from the field in GPPs, he's not the guy you want to target, despite the fact that he's probably the best points per dollar pitcher on the entire slate on any site today. That's just an outrageously low price, but you got to think he's probably going to be 30, 40% owned in GPPs at that price, because it'll let people load up on hitters where you can't really do that with guys over 10K like Sonny Gray and Chris Sale. Moving over to catcher and talking about some hitters here. There's nothing I really love at catcher today outside of Jonathan Lucroy at Coors Field. He's facing a lefty. He should be probably the highest owned catcher play by far. I'd be really surprised to see anyone else get anywhere near him. I mean, Posey's got Bolsinger today, which is a decent matchup, but at the same price as Lucroy, I think almost everyone's going that way. Miguel Montero was scratched yesterday. I expect him to be back in the lineup against Hughes today. He's probably my secondary option. He has Manny Grandal. I don't love against a ground ball pitcher in Heston, but he's okay at 4,000 on DraftKings. Pretty cheap on FanDuel, actually. Probably more in play there at 3,000. So keep an eye on him. As far as cheap catchers go, there's always going to be a couple cheap catchers in the lineup. I don't have anyone I'm really counting on today. I think Montero is probably the way I'm going to go if I want to save a little bit of money. However, we know how it works with catchers. Every once in a while, there's a guy who's near minimum that's hitting 5th or 6th in the order, and he becomes a really strong play at catcher where you can save a little bit of cap room there. So let's move on to first base, where we don't really need to save any cap room because there's a lot of solid top options today. I mentioned Montero against Hughes. Anthony Rizzo against Phil Hughes is an outstanding play on every site. He's probably my top first base play. The other expensive options, Paul Goldschmidt and Cabrera, face righties. Goldschmidt's got Shields today, which I'll probably avoid. I think it's going to be something ridiculous, like 108 degrees there or something today too, which is tough conditions to play in for anyone because it's just so hot. At Yankee Stadium, Miguel Cabrera is my preferred option between those two high-priced guys against Warren, who just isn't really a special pitcher. The rest of the guys at the top here aren't super exciting to me. Joey Votto is probably the other really interesting one against Dan Herron today, but he's more of a cash game play for me. We know he had a 3-home run game recently, but that's not Joey Votto, and I'm not going to go trying to count on that. As far as a couple other guys go, Freddie Freeman against DeGrom is an interesting play, but I prefer Votto, and they're really similar players. David Ortiz is interesting on both sites. He's really cheap on FanDuel, as we know. Only 4,000 on DraftKings tonight against Pino for KC, who's not a great pitcher. Ortiz has been solid, but not great against righties. Not a guy I really love, but I actually prefer him as a GPP play to a cash game play because he does have a nice game from time to time, but he's silent all too often for me to really like him in cash games. Couple other guys that are decent plays here. Mark Teixeira against Verlander, who hasn't come around yet, is a solid GPP play for 4,700. If you're looking for anyone cheap, Justin Bour remains really cheap on both sites. A lefty facing Mike Leake in Cincinnati that has a huge home run park factor. Not necessarily a huge run scored park factor, but gives you a nice chance at a home run for really cheap there. He's the only cheap option I would consider at first base today. As far as second base goes, we're looking at D. Gordon in that same scenario. Obviously, he's not a home run guy, but I like him against Leake. He should be on base a decent amount. Only 4,500 today is solid. I'd love for Jose Altuve to be in the lineup. He's really, really cheap on both sites tonight because of his injury and his struggles, but he's facing a lefty. Despite being at Seattle, this price is just too good to pass up if he's healthy enough to be in the lineup. Another guy for Miami that I like quite a bit, if you're not looking at D. Gordon, if Derek Dietrich is in the lineup at 3,400, another lefty against Leake that should be a solid play. Jason Kipnis, as always, when he's facing a righty, he's a great GPP play. Nathan Carnes isn't anything special. 4,800 for him should keep his ownership percentage down, and he becomes a really solid play. Another lefty who's facing a pretty weak righty in Almont for Philly is Colton Wong, only 3,400 at the top of that St. Louis lineup that we know doesn't hit a ton of home runs, but they produce runs almost every game, and they've been really, really solid all season. If you're looking for a couple cheap options, Dietrich is probably my favorite one, but if someone like Chris Negron is in the lineup today at 2,300 on DraftKings, minimum on FanDuel, I don't mind him in Cincinnati. Not too much else I'm really that excited about. I'm looking at Dietrich, Wong, really. If Neil Walker's in the lineup against Ross for Washington at the top, I don't mind him at all. He had a stomach illness yesterday, though, so I'm not counting on him being in the lineup today. I'm probably going to try and save a little bit more cap room at shortstop today than I am at second base, just because I like more of the second baseman at the top. Obviously, Troy Tulowitzki at shortstop is a solid play, but he's super expensive on both sides now that he's heated up. He's 4,600 on FanDuel, which is a little bit more palatable, but 5,600 on DraftKings really stings when you're trying to fit in a couple of these top pitchers. Hanley Ramirez is always a decent play at shortstop because of that eligibility for Boston. Pino's nothing that you really need to worry about. Despite the fact that he's a righty, Hanley Ramirez has been a little bit better against lefties, but he's been pretty cold overall lately, so he's definitely a GPP-only play for me. Gene Segura at Colorado against a lefty. If he's near the top of the order, that would be really nice, but he's been hitting at the bottom most of the time recently. We've seen him hit 7th and 8th, I think 6 of the last 7 games he's played, so I wouldn't expect him to be at the top of the order, but he might be because of the lefty matchup, and he's been a much better power hitter against lefties in his career. Francisco Lindor for Cleveland, one of those rookies everyone's been excited about, gets a righty in Carnes today. He should be a solid play at 3,600 on DraftKings, and it's just a solid play overall. If you're looking for cheaper guys at shortstop, that's the way I think I'm going today. Ruben Tejada is only 2,700 on DraftKings. He is pretty low on FanDuel as well at 2,500. That's probably my favorite play today at shortstop, just because I like saving that cap room, and there's nothing that I really love at the top outside of a really expensive Tulowitzki. So I think he'll be a little bit heavier owned, but he's probably worth it for the price discount on both sites. Segura is probably my favorite GPP play in the middle there, and that's the way I'm going to be going at shortstop. If we move over to third base here, there's quite a few solid options. Mark Reynolds continues to be really cheap for St. Louis, hitting 4th in the order. 2,700 on DraftKings, and I believe he is 2,800 on FanDuel. So he's a pretty solid upside option. He's not the player he used to be, obviously, but still has some pop in his bat, and that makes him a solid play at that price. I would rather pay up if I can today at third base, because outside of Reynolds, there's really not anything to love cheap-wise. Despite it being a righty-righty matchup, I like Chris Bryant a decent amount against Phil Hughes. Most of the Cubs offense, I think this becomes a pretty solid stack in GPPs. Probably a pretty popular one with how many home runs Hughes has given up in his career. So not necessarily a low-owned stack, but if you can pair him with the right pitchers, that should be a solid play. Jake Lamb continues to play third base for Arizona. Nice lefty bat for them. Facing Shields, so not an ideal matchup, but still a strong one. Chris Davis is a great GPP play at the Rogers Center in Toronto today against Marco Estrada, a righty. As we know, the Baltimore bats have been really hot lately. We can mention Manny Machado in the same breath. He's been red hot also. Probably going to be the more popular play. But on DraftKings, we can play Davis at third base. He's a really interesting GPP play to me. Not a ton in the mid-range that I like a lot. A lot of lefty-lefty matchups at third base with like Joey Gallo and Mike Moustakas today that I'll be avoiding. One really interesting mid-range play, mostly because he's at Coors Field, is Aramis Ramirez against the lefty and De La Rosa. He's been basically ice cold all season, but we know Aramis Ramirez has some pop in his bat, and he's been hitting 5th basically in the order every day. I believe he played DH yesterday, which was fine. He's been really, really cold, though. I haven't seen him score over 5 points in about a week on DraftKings. So hopefully he breaks out of that funk today. If he's sitting fifth in the lineup against the lefty, he's obviously a strong play. He's underpriced, even being at Coors because of how cold he's been. I really like that play, though. He's probably going to be a little heavier owned than I'd like him to be as a GPP play, but I think we can still fit him into our lineups a decent amount. And if he has a nice game, he's not going to be really heavily owned because people just don't have any confidence in him. I mean, I've been playing him a decent amount against lefties, and he's been pretty disappointing overall. Moving on to outfield, I think Giancarlo Stanton is my top outfielder of the day. His price agrees on, I believe, both sites. I think he's the most expensive outfielder that's playing today on FanDuel. I'm not expecting Bryce Harper to play, but we'll see. He's $5,200 on FanDuel, $5,600 on DraftKings. So I think that should keep his price down. At Cincinnati, feels like a home run waiting to happen. Mike Leake has been up and down this year. We know he's prone to blow up, though, so got to like him quite a bit. Obviously, all the righty bats in the outfield against De La Rosa, lefty for Colorado, are going to be heavy owned. They're all heavily priced. Ryan Braun, Carlos Gomez, those are the two popular ones. Obviously, you like those guys, but they're going to be heavy owned, probably right around 20 to 25% at the very least, being at Coors today with a lot of good pitchers on the mound. Charlie Blackmon against Milwaukee is a solid one for Colorado in that same vein. Carlos Gonzalez, another one. Any of those lefties against Jungmann for Milwaukee, you have to like. The fact that both pitchers in this game aren't strong pitchers is going to lead to a little bit of a decreased ownership percentage for all of these guys on both sides. So that'll be nice. A couple other guys to like in the mid-range here. Michael Brantley against Carnes, another Cleveland lefty, should be a solid play. Not a ton else I like in the mid-range here. I mean, Brett Gardner's solid against Verlander, but he's a little pricey for a guy that doesn't have a ton of power. Gregory Polanco finally gets a righty, so I'm sure he's excited about that. I'm sure he's tired of hitting at the bottom of the order for the Pirates because they've been facing so many lefties lately. Christian Yelich at 4,200 against Leak is another nice play for Miami in the bandbox in Cincinnati. A bunch of solid plays at the top. Those couple in the mid-range. We can take a look at some of these lower price plays also. If Tyler Moore is in the lineup against A.J. Burnett today, which I expect him to be if Bryce Harper's out, they don't really have a ton of other options of guys that can hit in the middle of the order. He's only 2,300. Could be hitting as high as 4th or 5th today if Harper's not in the lineup. Efrain Navarro against Sonny Gray. He's been playing against almost all righties for the Angels lately, hitting 6th or 7th in the order. I don't love him against Gray, but for a flat 2,000, there's some decent power upside there. I mentioned Gregory Polanco already. He's probably my favorite mid-price play at 3,600. It's really hard to argue with that price for him against a righty, especially if he's sitting at the top of the order. If he's first or second, I mean, you're probably looking at 5 at-bats against a pretty average righty in Ross today for $3,600 on DraftKings. He's also a pretty solid 2,500 on FanDuel, which is going to make him a pretty heavily owned play there. I prefer him on DraftKings because I think his ownership percentage will be a little bit lower. A couple lefty-lefty matchups with like Preston Tucker against Seattle today. Don't love that. Will Venable is an interesting play for San Diego against a righty in De La Rosa for 3,700 as a mid-priced play. Ben Paulsen is only 3,400, plays first base and outfield on DraftKings against Jungmann. We mentioned the Colorado lefties. I think Paulsen's a really, really strong play today as an outfielder. The problem with him on FanDuel is that he's only a first baseman there, so he's much, much harder to play, given all the other solid first base options. Another mid-price outfielder that is hard not to like if he's in the lineup, Chris Coghlan. Against Phil Hughes, we mentioned that Cubs stack being solid already. I think you can go any range there from about 1st to 7th or whatever, whenever you get to the pitcher. Whether you want to include Dexter Fowler, who's 3,900 against Hughes, or not, is really the question there. It'll be interesting to see who the Cubs hit 7th today. It might be Coghlan. It kind of depends on if Montero's back in the lineup. Whoever's sitting 7th is kind of going to determine that stack for me because I'm not absolutely sold on Fowler. He's not a big home run guy. So not someone that I'm really actively targeting against Hughes outside of him being included in a stack, especially in GPPs. Not too much else I'm loving in the mid-range either. Not a lot of cheap options. Probably smart to spend up in the outfield unless Tyler Moore is hitting high in the lineup. And then using Gregory Polanco is a big thing there. I think that'll wrap us up for outfielders. Thanks for checking it out. Be sure to check out all our daily fantasy content at dailyfantasycafe.com. It's all usually released around 4 Eastern time, and the podcast will be up on the site today. And be sure to check out our new lineup optimizer because it is humming.